All right, honestly, I think we can get started. So today's workshop is not going to be too long. I really only have about like 20 slides here, but I do think they do a good job of covering the gist and like the basis of what CTI is, which stands for Cyber Threat Intelligence. And for the most part, I'll refer to it as CTI because the full name is just a mouthful. It's kind of a both a skill that you would use, whether you're a security analyst, penetration tester, really anything of the sort. But it's also in it of itself a role, and that's a role that I've previously been in. And so I can speak to a good bit of my experience and touch a little bit on the cases I worked in, some of the threat actors I was involved with. So we're just going to introduce the topic, more so what I was just doing. We're going to talk a little bit about the intelligence lifecycle. If any of you guys are critical intelligence studies minors, then this will seem familiar to you. We're going to catalog the different types of threats, IOCs, which stand for indicators of compromise. Some of the frameworks that go into CTI work, the CTI Rosetta Stone, which I will explain what that is once we do get to that, and just kind of some tools that we see. So this definition I stole straight from the CrowdStrike website, and it does a really good job of kind of encapsulating what CTI is. It is really just a contextualization of the data that we see in cybersecurity related incidents. So we analyze the motives behind the human behind the keyboard. We analyze the targets, the victimology involved, the attack behaviors, and the goal of putting that all together is so we can have a picture of what allows us to do what's called a threat-informed defense. In security, there's no way to really be fully prepared to defend against absolutely everything. You're going to have some sort of attack surface, and the best way to handle that attack surface is to cater to the specific threats that you have. And a lot of times you'll hear threats referred to as APTs, Advanced Persistent Threat Actors. The interesting thing about CTI is there's a lot of acronyms, but these acronyms kind of precede cybersecurity as a whole. So whether you see APT, IOC, TTP, it's going to be in all other aspects and not just CTI. So whether or not this is something you want to get into as a field, a lot of the terminology is going to be a cornerstone of regardless of the kind of work you end up doing in security. Actually, and you'll see a lot of these pictures around if you do get into the CTI space. This is artwork of what's supposed to be a threat actor. This is, if you've heard of Scattered Spider, but also referred to as Alpha V or Black Hat. They're a ransomware as a service gang. So what essentially that means is they license out their ransomware for less sophisticated cyber criminals to use. So instead of having to create their own, they just use Scattered Spider's ransomware. Whatever ransom gets paid, Scattered Spider maybe makes 40% of the proceeds or something of that sort. They've actually been in the news a lot lately. I would say they're the most prolific cyber criminal gang. They operate out of Russia. I don't want to give away too much because they honestly themselves could be a really interesting general meeting topic. But just so you know, you see this kind of artwork, it usually is related to threat actors in the space. It's actually supposed to be a little like knock to Napoleon Dynamite with the afro and the phones. So the threat intelligence lifecycle itself is just kind of how we go about this research process. There's a few different diagrams. If you look up a intelligence lifecycle, some have 5 steps, some have 4. This one has 7. Really, the main point is just kind of we get all this data from incidents. You know, if you have an endpoint detection tool, if you have a firewall, you get all these logs. And we, you know, threat intelligence, we kind of want to say, well, what do these logs tell us, and what does it encapsulate, and who's being involved? So we collect that information, we process it, and we enrich it so it's more normalized. If you're familiar with data science, just kind of normalization of data so it's more human readable. And then from that point, we go into analysis and production to kind of get a general idea to prove whatever hypothesis our research is. So if we have an incident, and based on what our company does, and based on some of the things we see, we think it's a maybe APT from Russia. The analysis and production phase is where we're going to kind of start stitching things together to be able to say whether it is or isn't. And most of the time, you'll read a lot of articles that, you know, Iranian actor was involved in this incident, Russian actor was involved in this incident. The majority of the time, we don't know. It's actually a harder process than people tend to give it credit for because it's so easy to obfuscate yourself. You know, nation state actors, cyber criminals, they're very sophisticated hackers, and they don't exactly leave a calling card like, hey, by the way, this is the Russian Federation. So it's a process that is very like delicate and really easy to mess up because a lot of the things we see are ephemeral. The IPs change, the domains change. So this has to be executed precisely and quickly. And it's kind of important to have this sort of epistemology, if you will, to how you conduct it. But this shouldn't concern you if you're not going into threat intelligence, but it's just something that you might be interested in. Then the easiest way to kind of break up threats are into three groups. These groups are not mutually exclusive. So a group can be a hacktivist and simultaneously be a cyber criminal and simultaneously even be a nation state. So there's a few countries that in their cyber operations tend to straddle the line between multiple groups. So hacktivists, the easiest example is, I'm sure everyone's at least heard of Anonymous. Truth be told, they don't actually make the rounds in terms of cybersecurity news in the last like decade or so, really. These are groups that are always ideologically motivated. A lot of times you'll hear hacktivists and you will think like just Anonymous, but really this encapsulates a lot of terrorist groups. We kind of have this interesting dynamic where computers, they're becoming so affordable and so cheap. Like even in countries where the economic prospects aren't great, you still see everybody walking around with a smartphone. And even computers are not that hard to come by. And that makes it such an easy vector for influence operations and cyber attacks, even for a lot of terrorist groups that are poorly funded. As a whole, hacktivists tend to be poorly funded and they are flatly organized. Really what that just means is you could think of the hierarchy of the entire group as just flat. There's really no designated leader. And there's really like no trickle down of roles. Cyber criminals are the same way, where usually it's just completely flatly organized. These are the groups that are almost entirely financially motivated. So the most recent examples that anyone ever sees of this is just ransomware or just any other sort of cyber extortion, but this could also relate to more devious things like human trafficking and sextortion. Sometimes they are as well funded as nation state groups, and you'll see this like really like crazy thing where ransomware gangs, they will have their own like IT help center. Like if you get ransomed, you call that help center and they will provide details, instructions, and like customer support. And it's like done so in a professional manner. It's a lucrative business, and like one of the questions that often get asked in cybersecurity is, well, why is there such a talent shortage? Because if you are really talented, you could realistically go make a lot of money doing crime, and it's much harder to catch cyber criminals than people usually think. Nation states, these are what I was mentioning previously. There's what's often referred to in cybersecurity as the big four, that being China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This is at least from a very like Western perspective, because this is a lot of the nations that Western cybersecurity companies like Cisco, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto focus their research into, and same with the United States intelligence community. It's usually focused on those four. Some middle power nations are starting to become impactful in the cybersecurity space, like India, Pakistan, Turkey even. And a lot of times what we're able to use to deduce whether a certain attack was carried out by a nation state actor or a cyber criminal group or a hacktivist group is what we refer to as indicators of compromise, or IOCs more plainly. You could think of these as the breadcrumbs that are left behind. So like I said before, there's never going to be a note that says, hi, we were here. But what you will find is connections from C2 domains, which stands for command and control. I'll go more into depth of what that means because that's very important. Staging domains, a lot of times, if a piece of malware is oftentimes the first stage in a process where it will redirect you to a domain that downloads the next payload. Phishing landing pages, these are a classic example of, let's say you get, you want an Apple gift card email, you click on the link, it takes you to a fake Apple page. Again, this is all stuff that gets picked up in a company's logs, and not even just, organizations that have cybersecurity tools. This is a lot of times in your own like Windows computer logs. You'll find these kind of things. IP addresses, these can all be applied to the previous stuff about domains, but this also could be infected bots from a botnet. So let's say Oleg's computer gets compromised and I'm a threat actor and I want to hack Trish. I don't have to go through my computer. I can just use his IP, and that constitutes a botnet. Fast flux IPs, these are oftentimes when cyber criminals will change their IP at a very, very fast rate to kind of evade detection and evade attribution. And Tor exit nodes are just, if you remember Harris's workshop on Tor, the IPs that the individual using Tor exits out on, that obviously isn't their IP, but it's been routed 3 times. Those are those. A lot of times with the malware that's seen, threat intelligence is kind of cool, and it's a field that straddles cybersecurity strategy and malware analysis at the same time. So you could have what are malware hashes. So for those not familiar, any file can be hashed into these are some of the more common examples of hashes. So the most common one I've seen is SHA-256. and this hash itself identifies what the file is, and should any bit or anything at all be changed in the file, the hash will be different. What this allows is for heuristic rule scanning. So sorry about the light mode. If we go to a example of a article about a certain cyber incident, so I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of Fancy Bear. It's one of the more notorious APTs. They're actually the ones who hacked the DNC in 2016 and were involved in SolarWinds. A lot of times, and typically, like if you do get a cyber threat intelligence, these are going to be the products you're putting out. It'll be these structured reports that detail the attacks and the tools you used and all the indicators of compromise. So in my role over the course of 3 months, I had put out about 5 or so of these for the nation state actors I was working on. Here's an example of a what the landing page works. So they own this domains cdnverify.net, and this was the landing page of it. And if we go into the IOCs that are listed throughout this report, what you would do if you're a defender is you would say, okay, I need to make sure my firewall, my EDR, they're aware of these hashes, they're aware of these domains, and if you're using an email solution like Proofpoint, they're aware of these subject lines, and my EDR or antivirus is aware of these file names. Now, these are all subject to change. Like if Fancy Bear wanted to, it would be very easy to change all of these. However, we still want to have these logged, and we have a lot of tools in the cybersecurity space. VirusTotal being a very famous one. This, I would say, VirusTotal is probably the most famous cybersecurity tool outside of the cybersecurity space. It's not uncommon for people to just kind of like, in general, toss stuff in here that they're worried is malicious and it ends up on their computer. And it's a great tool because of that. It's owned by Google and it has a huge repository. So if we throw in one of the hashes from the report and just search it, what it'll tell us is all the vendors that flagged it. So this is more than obviously malicious. A lot of times, if you're doing research and you stumble across a new file, you'll get a score of something like 2 out of 4 or 2 to 4 out of however many vendors. It really depends on the total amount that they're checking, but usually it's between 70 and 80. And so here you have, let me see, so ClamAV, Bitdefender, these are more well-known ones. Avast, Google, Fortinet, they all detect this. And this would be the same for all these IOCs. We'll get into a little bit of what we can do with the domain. What's up?
So is it fair to assume mostly you end up with a file download or some link that's just a bunch of jumble and letters and numbers? It's probably one of these.
So not necessarily. These hashes aren't what you see on your computer. So you would see, let's just say, for example, let's just pretend that this hash corresponds to this PDF. This PDF could be invoice for Patrick, a PDF. Yeah. But when you hash the file, you do a mathematical operation on it. This is the hash that corresponds to it.
How do you hash it?
They're just command line commands in Linux, or you could just use an online tool for it.
Right.
There's
upload the file to a hash.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
There's genuine purposes for hashing in the sense that it preserves file integrity. So if what's a good example here? So if you guys were doing Hivestorm yesterday, you noticed that each of the downloads had a corresponding hash on the download page, and that's there. So when you do download it, you check the hash to make sure that's exactly what you downloaded. And if it's not, like I said, if one bit of anything gets changed, the hash will be totally different for pretty much every file. But these are a good way to like do research like we just did. We were like, what's this file? We threw it into VirusTotal. We saw that over 60 vendors mark it as the Sophos malware, which is where Fancy Bear actually gets its name. However, there's also an aspect where you could do malware analysis on the physical file. So I just have an icon representing an executable, a PDF, which would be a typically embedded macros, and a PowerShell script, because in my experience, these are kind of what started to become, I almost want to say, the meta of what threat actors are using, because a lot of times these PDFs and PowerShell scripts, they're part of what are called living off the land techniques, where they're not exactly going to be picked up by a lot of solutions because PowerShell is a trusted software. It's literally Microsoft, and PDF similar. Like you have to actually take an extra step to check if the PDF has an executable, and then even if it has execution permissions, and even then check what those exactly would be. Let me just check if there's any questions on the Zoom.
Email won't let you send PowerShell scripts directly from your computer. You have to put a drive first.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense, because a lot of times they end up in malicious purposes, and it's hard to get checked for PowerShell scripts and Bash scripts because it's a trusted tool on the operating system. So I mentioned C2s before. These are really important to know. Basically, this is the server that the threat actor would use to run all their commands. So whether they're using it to control a botnet, whether they're using it to send over different stages in the malware payloads, or whether they're just using it, just as like an info stealer, just to spy over your logs, over your network traffic. It's all going to be communicated to their C2, and they're going to contact the C2. They're not going to ever really do it from their own client, just because that's a lot more risky. So they'll have a C2 server, and so I'm going to, throughout this workshop, just kind of touch on a lot of the topics in threat intelligence. The next workshop that I will be doing on this, I believe in November, is going to be how to actively hunt these C2 servers. So there's a way in which we can take this domain, but I'm not sure if it's a C2, but it is a associated domain, and we could search using various tools, and I'll show those tools in a second, for the kind of characteristics associated with it. And then we could take that and be like, well, we have these characteristics. Let's see what other domains exist on the internet that have these characteristics and see if they're associated with that threat actor. So that's really cool stuff. That'll be its own workshop, but definitely, like, in general, you'll hear the word C2 used a lot, and really what it just stands for is command and control. A lot of the terms actually, not just in the threat intelligence space, but in the cybersecurity space, come from military. So another one is TTPs. You'll hear this one a lot. This just stands for tactics, techniques, and procedure. Truthfully, you could really use all of these interchangeably if you wanted to, and a lot of people do, but they do have their own distinct meaning based on each letter. So tactics are the overarching objectives. So if your objective is to get root access on a machine, that's the tactic. The technique is the way in which this is executed. So that could be something like you're going to get initial access, then you're going to use privilege escalation. And procedures are the specific actions themselves on a more granular level. So that could be you're going to use malware for it, you're going to exploit this specific vulnerability, or you're going to use a tool. So I have what's linked here is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This is something that if you do get into the CTI space is really important, but even if you don't, you're going to see these techniques a lot. So I know it's a lot of jumble on the screen, but really what this is all the different catalog techniques under each tactic. So reconnaissance has a few techniques. This is probably the easiest one to understand in terms of like technicality. Active scanning, if you remember from the Hack the Box walkthrough workshop, use the Nmap is just active scanning. You're scanning the network for open ports. Resource development, this is you either acquire credentials from their infrastructure, from what you acquire which ports are open. Initial access is the process of actually getting inside. Execution is usually what you start to, I guess easy ways is kind of do. This could be anything from executing malware. This could be anything from stealing further credentials, forging certificates. Persistence is how you maintain access. So, you're not just booted off as soon as the computer is reset. Privilege escalation is if you get an account that is maybe a regular user, how do you get to a point where you get a root access? Defense evasion, this one is super important. This is kind of how you evade all these tools that end up being put on a network. So that could be the EDR, that could be the firewall. Credential access, usually this is at that point you get compromised for the domain controller and you just kind of get root access entirely. Discovery, this one's kind of hard to explain by itself, but in tandem with lateral movement, this is kind of further discovering the network. Even if you scan a network, even if you do get access to one machine, that doesn't give you the full insight of everything that's on there. What other accounts are there, what domains are trusted, what tools are on it. Lateral movement is just moving from machine to machine across the network. Collection is typically, a lot of time this is, well, it even has here a man-in-the-middle attacks. At that point, you're really just compromising functions on the network to collect either credentials or just packets flowing through it. Command and control, that's what I mentioned earlier with the C2 servers. Exfiltration, you just take the data, and impact is pretty much what ends up happening in the aftermath. So you see there's a whole facet of techniques here, and this is useful to kind of categorize what is exactly happening and remediate it, because if you go into each technique, let's just say remote server session hijacking, the great thing is you have mitigations here. So if you can identify intelligently what's going on, you have access to mitigations here and detections. And a lot of tools, they will have MITRE technique IDs built in them, so you can kind of navigate and like kind of like a playbook enable various things based on their ID. That's what makes it useful for pretty much everyone in this space, but what makes it really useful for threat intelligence is we can piece together kind of from start to finish how the incident unfolded, and from that point we could be like, this looks identical to this other incident we've seen, or this looks totally different to what our initial hypothesis was, so maybe this could be someone else. There's a few different matrices here. The enterprise one is the one that gets used the most often. There's a cloud one that is starting to get more popular as things move to on-prem, off-prem environments. As you can see, it even has a few different categories. There's just no reconnaissance or resource development here. The mobile matrix I used to use a good bit at work, especially the Android one. Again, a lot of what you'll have here is all the same techniques you'll see in the enterprise one, but it just kind of narrowed down for the specific operating system. And then ICS is industrial control systems. This one isn't fully fleshed out. As you can see, there's no sub-techniques here. And what I mean by that is the techniques in the enterprise matrix, you could open up and you have sub-techniques. ICS, in general, is kind of a really, honestly, scarily untapped area in cybersecurity where it is so critical because you were talking about the kind of systems that provide water, that provide electricity. We had a tabletop exercise at my job a few weeks ago where one of the industrial control systems in Monmouth County failed and added too much, I forget what chemical, into the water, and that started to hospitalize people. And then that hospital was the subject of a ransomware attack. Obviously, this is a fictional situation, but it kind of like put together totality of how important these industrial control systems are. But it is just a really useful tool. And the main takeaway is that if you do kind of see like these like weird like numbers like TI 595 throughout your cybersecurity career, you kind of just have to be like, oh, that's the MITRE technique, and just go to this site and just look it up. Let me check if there's some questions. Okay. The different technologies for malware detection using signature detection, couldn't you just add a benign statement, new variable 5-tier malware, and generate a different unique hash to evade detection? Yeah, exactly. This is a great question. Actually, it's perfectly segues me into the next point. Here is Brendan Fleury. Okay, yeah, he is perfect. Yeah, exactly. That is completely right. And that is what a lot of threat actors do. So what we have for that is what's called the pyramid of pain. The pyramid of pain refer to different IOCs and how difficult they are to change. And based on their difficulty to change, they're more annoying for the threat actors. So at the bottom, like Brendan just mentioned, hash values, these are super easy to change. You could even like change it even more simpler than just adding a new variable. IP addresses also are easy to change. If you have a domain, if you have that infrastructure for a domain, you could just move that from IP to IP. A lot of hosting providers will let you do that with, nothing whatsoever. Similarly, you could change that domain name pretty simply if, the detection rules are blocking XYZ to XYZ. It's not that much more difficult for me to change the domain and change the IP, and whatever malware payload is being staged or upload a different version with something that changes the hash. So that is like completely true, and that's why a lot of times you won't see the same kind of heuristic antivirus that you saw like 20 years ago. Back when everybody had Norton or ESET on their computers, the way that those antiviruses used to work is they would just be entirely heuristic based on hash values, based on IPs, based on domains. They had no way in figuring out what the specific indicator did in order to, not allow it through. If the thing was changed that beat the rule that I had, then it would just get through regardless of what the behavior was. So this is kind of an important concept to understand that. The hardest thing to change are TTPs, that being the exact way that the execution occurs, because this involves changing your victimology, changing your tooling, and these are things that are fundamental to the way threat actors behave. So when we are presented with a challenge of attribution and how to figure out who did what, the best way to look at that is through what tools were used, what kind of malware in terms of its functionality, what kind of network artifacts we see in terms of not the IPs themselves, but the ways in which they were procured. So an IP can be changed pretty quickly, but if your threat actor is always using Namecheap and Cloudflare to procure their infrastructure, in regards to how many times they changed their domain and IP, that's kind of something that you could attribute to them. And that's one of the things that are a little bit hard to change because now they have to, find a new provider. And the thing about when they do create a lot of these domains, they use a lot of legitimate providers, which are a little bit wise to the actions. So Cloudflare will take down these IPs or domains if they see them. But because they are such a big company, it's pretty easy to slip through the cracks. But that just goes to show that these things, again, are very ephemeral in the sense that they are on a shorter time. So I hope that actually explained the question. And the pyramid pane, what do you mean by tools? This is just kind of the malware or the other penetration testing tools. So if I'm a threat actor and I use Nmap for scanning, there are a few other options there, but for the most part, like just for argument's sake, like I'm going to consistently use this tool because I'm comfortable with it. It's what I learned, and maybe I have an enterprise version that is expensive, or for a lot of other tools, it's possible that there might be only like one or two different tools that present that certain task. And especially if we have our own dedicated closed source malware, it's different when a threat actor will use a commodity malware that is open source, or even will use a malware as a service. But if they have their own created malware, it behaves and functions in a way that is typically at least unique enough to an extent where we can piece together multiple incidents that have that exact same malware execution and functionality. A lot of times, if they do change the hashes and the IPs, it's funny to see this happen where they will do so in the same way for all of their IOCs. So it's just kind of like, oh, well, this is very similar behaviorally to this one, and it was only changed just recently, but also we saw all these other things change. So it's just kind of a culmination of you can think of their tech stack and their suite. If I were to show you a specific tech stack and say company A uses this, and I show you another one and say company B uses this, we would have to get through a ton of companies before we had two companies with the exact same tech stack. And a lot of times this is the same situation for the tools that threat actors use. So I hope that answers that. I know that was a little bit of a long-winded answer. But TTPs, again, like the way start to finish, these are the hardest to change because at the end of the day, these are humans behind the screen and they behave patternistically and are susceptible to making the same mistakes. These are two other frameworks that are important in like CTI theory, but aren't always the most applied in terms of a workplace. So I'll get through these pretty quickly. This is what's called the diamond model of attribution. Basically, you can think of it as those kind of like cork boards you'll see in a cop show where it's like they pin up the picture and they pin up the picture of the gun that was found and they pin up the picture of the drug vials that were found. This is kind of, what do we know about this adversary? What infrastructure do they have? So what domains, IPs, how do they procure it? Who are the often victims? One of the biggest indicators of who a threat actor might be is the victimology. Over the summer, working, the best example that I had was we would see, and shocker to nobody, Pakistan targeting India a lot. However, what really gave it away was the incessant frequency and speed in which they would target Indian entities in government and education with attacks that had no financial benefit to them. So they were clearly focused on a nation state espionage. But what was really interesting is that they would target the same exact exploit every time in a specific version of the Linux kernel, surely because India's government uses a proprietary version of Linux for a lot of their systems, and that version of the kernel is susceptible to the dirty pipe exploit. So we see a dirty pipe focused piece of malware that is coming from infrastructure that we have associated with Pakistan before. And obviously this is an exploit that really only these days works on a very old version of Linux kernel, which isn't so old when it comes to India's Bharat and Boss OS operating systems. So that's kind of a way in which you could kind of put those pieces together. So really in that example, you kind of see a little bit of every angle of that. The next framework is the cyber kill chain. This was developed by Lockheed Martin, and this is pretty much very similar to the MITRE attack chain, so I won't spend too much time on it. But a lot of times, for the purposes of research, you'll see various attacks mapped out across these objectives. As far as evading the behavior detection, could you run useless commands in between the malicious commands of your malware? Yeah, actually, Another really good point, and this is something that I think we'll touch on more in the malware analysis workshop, not just those kinds of commands. You wouldn't actually need to be the one to put those in. There's something called malware packers that you could just download open source and use on your malware. And while they don't necessarily do a lot of useless commands, they will inject with enough junk code that a lot of times it will get past detection tools, because the majority of the code base, and especially when it's decompiled, is observed to be benign. And like hackers will end up making like 99% of the code base. It'll be like humongous amount, and then a very, very small portion will actually end up being the malware itself. A lot of times running junk commands can serve to your detriment if you're going to do that, because you don't know if your junk command is going to set off a specific detection. At the end of the day, a lot of these detection tools are not just configured by, if you get, let's say, a SIEM from Splunk or Cisco or Google, you're going to be, as a security analyst or engineer, writing your own detection rules. So you have no idea if random commands will set off a detection anyway. But yeah, there are kind of ways to bloat malware so it gets past evasion. But those are really good questions, but they're more focused on malware analysis, which I like because it's also an interest of mine. But we're going to go more in depth into packers, into evasion in a different workshop. One thing that's really important in general, even if you're not going to be in the threat intelligence space, are feeds and sources. So my favorite cybersecurity feed is Cywire. So I'll just open this up real quick. This is pretty much an aggregation of all the various recent news articles that you'll see in the cybersecurity space. You could, I have an email subscription on this, totally free, where every day I get the 10 most important and recent articles of the last like 48 hours sent to my email. When I put this in the slide this morning, a few of these weren't even here. And these are from all kinds of sources. You have Dark Reading, Security Affairs, Healthcare InfoSec, The Record, which is Recorded Futures, Next.gov, another The Record. And so many of these are just today. It really compiles so much. You're not going to miss anything that happens in cybersecurity using Cywire. If you'll see this one, Brazil's federal police arrest hacker US DOD. If you guys remember hearing on the news about that supposed database breach of all the social security numbers of the National Public Database, that was claimed by US DOD. And he also claimed that he caused the CrowdStrike outage, when everybody knows I was the one who caused that outage. Huh?
That CrowdStrike was.
That's called insider trading.
I think they find out.
I'm going to jail for you. The point being, I would recommend everyone, like, even if you don't want to get into the threat intelligence space, subscribe to this newsletter, because you'll find out a lot of resources. And this is kind of, in the threat intelligence space, how you start up a lot of your research. Is you'll find an article and you'll see indicators on that article, and you want to go more into it. And I'll give you an example. So, do you guys remember BlackBerry, the little phones?
Yeah.
They're a really good cybersecurity company. It's one of the craziest things ever. They're one of the best. And I say that while working for a competitor, so you know that's genuine. And I really love the research that they do. And what you have here, I'm already started scrolling, is their global threat intelligence report. So every quarter, every year, a lot of companies, they will put out threat intelligence reports. So this is just an icon of CrowdStrike's. This is one that Elastic has. They're just a vendor for a specific tool. And what's great about these global reports is because these companies have so much telemetry, which just means how much data they collect, because their products are on so many machines, they're able to collect a lot of really interesting insights. So commercial enterprises, 66% of those attacks against them were stopped. There's a lot of interesting things about cloud, and usually these threat reports, because that's becoming more and more of a big thing. And yeah, the usual comment of all these reports is that there are more and more and more attacks happening every day, exponentially growing, which again, we'll always say is good job security for us, but makes the role more stressful. And actually, Brennan had mentioned the hashes being changed. This section of the report dives a little bit in depth into that, and that the unique hashes do get changed very frequently because it is a common evasion technique. And one thing I just want to show real quick is this is personally a piece of research that I worked on and expanded upon. So this was, like I mentioned before, Pakistan targeting India. And what I was able to do, and as you can see here, the MITRE techniques that kind of detail what happens here. So again, the reason why TTPs were at the top of the pyramid of pain is because if you see an exact same replication of these identical TTPs, you know who you're dealing with. There's like, an icicle shot in hell that a threat actor will copy all of these exactly, even if they try to intentionally. Especially when it came to, and here what we have is the tool section, so the weapons that they use. They were very fond of Go and Rust in their and as their programming language of choice. Which one? Most used? Here? Yeah. So actually, interestingly enough about this, a lot of times you'll find in different threat intelligence research teams, there's conflicting opinions on who a threat actor might be. Well, most of the research community was kind of unanimously thought that this activity was done by the Pakistani intelligence service. Which specific threat actor in that service, that was debated on, and they use a version of the Mythic C2 infrastructure, which was previously is close source and it's associated with a different Pakistan Nexus threat actor. So a lot of including BlackBerry, like because they use this infrastructure that they're this actor, but our research kind of showed a little bit of a different light because of the way they were procuring their domains. That's more tangential, but again, like these are kind of the characteristics that really well detail who is doing what. Eddie, am I good to go down? Cool. And one of the things that you would do if you are working in threat intelligence, and that will, the next workshop that I do will be a focus on, is down where we have the IOCs, we have all these domains. Now, actually, interestingly enough, a lot of these domains are imitating military education institutes in India. So you could think of like equivalents like West Point or the Naval Academy. There's a few domains here. I was able to find about 8 or 10 more that with high confidence we could also attribute that weren't found in this research, because at the end of the day, the domains found are only through what the endpoints actually see. And if we want to find ones that aren't seen by the endpoints, we have to do what's called infrastructure hunting, which I know I'm peddling that other workshop a lot, but in that one I'll be able to get into the weeds of like how we can toss in a domain into a tool and get more infrastructure out of it. And also, one more feed that I want to touch on is Abuse CH. So this is actually not one platform, but it's split up into 6. So, and again, this is like most things here, it's not solely for threat intelligence, but there's a few really cool things here. The most common one I've seen used, and the one I'm most familiar with, is Malware Bazaar. Literally, you could just go here and I'm not a robot. Oh no, I never get through these. Amazing. Do you like count this one? Because it's like barely in. Definitely a robot. So here are the hash values associated with the malware, and you could even download them. So be very, very careful with this. Only do this in a virtual machine, and make sure it's segmented off the network. It gives you the type of malware, whether it's an executable, whether it's a Excel file with macros. And there's just like hundreds of thousands of these, and it's really cool, especially if you do have a hash. So let me actually just see if our is it still open? If our SOFAC sample is here, because if it is, hypothetically, if I was doing research right now, I would be able to just straight up download it and analyze it. It is not. Anyway, the other ones that are here, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this tracker is for specifically C2 servers. And you could even download these so they get ingested immediately into whatever IDS you're using. Specifically, I guess here just Suricata. And there's also a botnet list. And if you do get into the cybersecurity space, you'll see a lot of these botnet names pretty frequently, like Pikabot, Crackbot, and also Mirai, which I don't know how many people were here for the first general meeting, but that botnet originated from here at Rutgers, and that was used to take down the web registration system because the CS student who created it was pissed that he couldn't get the classes he wanted. And he did that multiple times. And that story will never be funny to me because, like, to this day, we still see Mirai botnet, specifically in IoT devices, as maybe like the 3rd biggest botnet. And that's all because like somebody was that mad at Rutgers. Like, I could get pretty mad at Rutgers, but never that much. SSL Blacklist, these are just certificates that are usually custom created. That if you download, if a specific domain has one of those, or also there's TLS certificates here. URL Haas, I'm not too familiar with what this one is. ThreadFox is just general IOC, so you'll see domains, URLs, IPs. And the great thing about like a tool like this is, unlike VirusTotal, a lot of times there's integrations here that you can just immediately kind of ingest everything, and it's free in that way. Yara, I will get to in a second what Yara is. Yara is a very cool thing. So I'm curious, what are like, oh, what's up? Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
So I just was wondering, how did you get the permission for the access to the data for the research that you did?
Right. So primarily it was all open source. So if we go back to the IOCs here, I would just take this and enrich it. So oh, I was going to wait till closer to the end to use this specific tool, but I could just show you just for example. So as soon as this loads, when we do have these kinds of domains from this open source reporting from BlackBerry, a lot of times what we get from it are subdomains, resolution records, and passive DNS records. And with what passive DNS records we can do is we could see what other IPs this domain previously had sat at. Then we can check those IPs to see if there were any other domains. So a lot of times you'll have, let's say, this is just off the top of my head, I don't know if this is actually true. Let's say this domain and this domain once sat at the same IP. We could query that IP and see that there was another domain that was also a .in domain that was very similar in its structure. Maybe it was imitating a different entity within India, and we could say with pretty high confidence that that was also related to this actor. On top of that, we could also cross-check the DNS servers that these domains point to, the time that they were registered. So a lot of times when these threat actors are working, they work 9 to 5s like the rest of us. So they'll register all their domains at like 9:01, 9:02 a.m., 9:03 a.m. And mainly it's like a combination of those characteristics. We were able to find more. I didn't really have any sort of like confidential database, although a lot of people in the space do kind of get that. And that's mainly from, let's just say, for instance, CrowdStrike. Their product is on a lot of machines. I'm sure, as you've seen with 8 million computers being down, a lot of computers had CrowdStrike, and that's a lot of computers ingesting all these IPs and domains. And so a lot of people, when they do try to do this kind of research, they can go into that repository of data that CrowdStrike has internally and just kind of sift through that and try to find certain things. So it's a mix of like open source reporting, but also what your tool can pick up. The reason why you'll see threat intelligence work being done at a company like CrowdStrike is because they have that kind of capability. A smaller company that doesn't, or let's just say like not a cybersecurity company, let's say FedEx, for example, they don't have a detection tool on every endpoint across 6 continents. So they don't exactly have the telemetry. So it's just mainly those two things. I don't know if that answers what you were asking. Does it kind of? Okay, cool. Let me check if there's any questions in Zoom. That's cool to use Mythic C2. That's what I use with Poseidon agents, the club botnet I made back in May. Oh, interesting. Do threat intelligence analysts do much hands-on work like malware analysis or creating signature behavior configurations for security software? So the latter I've never seen being done, but in terms of working with malware analysis, actually, yeah, we do create signature. I'm wrong about that. And I'll show you why. We create like YAR rules mostly. But in terms of malware analysis, so it really depends on the threat intelligence shop. Personally, I am able to do malware analysis strictly on APKs because looking at higher level language is just something that I can actually analyze. Looking at binaries decompiled into C and X8 and assembly, I can't comprehend. A lot of times, a lot of threat intelligence teams will have a malware analysis team separate. So what that kind of relationship looks like is we'll be the ones to find the sample. Because let's say I do find a new domain and I go to it and it's a staging domain and it downloads a different sample. I could pass that off to my malware analysis team and they could tell me what's in there. And a lot of times what's in there will be more IPs because a lot of pieces of malware will have a hard-coded IP that can serve for communication. So it's a mixed bag, and I will say that it is a skill that is good to have in the threat intelligence space, but not a necessity. I know some people who do it. I know some people who do it partially. I know some people who don't do any malware analysis at all. And I personally kind of sit somewhere in the middle. But yeah, it definitely helps as a skill. In terms of, I mentioned earlier a Rosetta Stone, and for those who don't know, the Rosetta Stone was a stone I believe found in Egypt, I want to say, that had the same exact text written in ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian, and I want to say maybe Phoenician. I could totally be wrong about the languages there. And the reason it was so important was because we know what ancient Greek looks like and what it means, and we had an idea of what Phoenician looked like, but we didn't know a lot of what it would say. But because it was the same text, we were able to kind of use it to translate Egyptian. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times in the threat intelligence space, you'll hear the term as a way to kind of refer to the absurd amounts of naming conventions. So this is the most painful thing about threat intelligence, and it's something that has to be said. Who here like knows any like specific like any hacker group, any threat actor, any name?
Anonymous.
Never heard of a single one? Oh, what was that?
Anonymous.
Okay, cool. That might be the one exception because they kind of like named themselves and they were looking for the attention. What was that? Lapsus, right. Cool. They're also, I believe, they're more like a hacker for fun group. Now, yeah.
Not to be confused with they used to. There's another hacking agency, I forgot what country it's affiliated with, that is the former name of Child Protective Services. Like there's a hacker group called Douglas. I'm not joking about that.
I haven't heard of that one.
It does exist. Real? I think. But it does exist.
Lapsus is a good one. I don't know off the top of my head what some other names might be for Lapsus. If anyone in the Zoom has any idea. Cozy Bear. Okay, this is exactly what I'm looking for. Lazarus too. Okay. Cozy Bear. The thing is, if you go to a Microsoft report and you look for Cozy Bear, you're not going to find Cozy Bear because that's the name CrowdStrike uses. What Microsoft does is they will, for all their Russian, because Cozy Bear is a Russian-based actor, they will use the name Blizzard. And this is really annoying because more often than not, you will be confused out of your mind talking about the same actor because so many different names exist for the same damn actor. And I'm glad Lazarus Group was mentioned because that's the colloquial name for it. And truthfully, it's the oldest when it comes to really any North Korean hacking group. A lot of times they'll all be referred to as Lazarus. But if you go to CrowdStrike, that's referred to as Labyrinth Chalima. Cisco calls it Group 77. Dell calls it Hastati, which I have no idea why that's the case because I think that's something to do with Rome. Neuromantic Cyber Army Team. Zinc. This is actually the worst. So before Microsoft had this dumb like weather naming convention, they would use the periodic table. And then they realized that there's more hackers out there than elements on the periodic table, go figure. And so you kind of have this kerfuffle where it's really hard to go through reporting because everyone has a different name for these threat actors. Because again, they don't really leave names themselves, and there has to be some way to categorize them. The convention that I'm most fond with is the way Mandiant, which is owned by Google, does it, where they just kind of give it a number. So APT37. But if you like read the news, especially when it comes to this example with North Korea, you'll see pretty much any North Korean threat actor referred to as the Lazarus Group, when that could be literally any one of 5 or so threat actors that they have. Again, same with Russia. I mentioned Fancy Bear earlier. They're referred to as APT28, Group 74. Fancy Bear is honestly one of the more common ones and the one I personally use. But this is just worth noting because a lot of times you want to make sure that you don't get too hung up on the name of the threat actor. Kind of like their origin of attribution and the tools they use are far more important in terms of the research done, but also how we can have a threat-informed defense against them. Lizard Squad also lapses. Okay, yeah. LolSec, yep. Yeah.
Don't forget about our own hacker group, the Equation Group.
I haven't heard of that one.
Affiliated.
Drop that in the Discord because I haven't seen that one before. And truthfully, I spend more time on the nation state side of the house, so a lot of the hacktivist groups and e-crime groups I'm not as familiar with. Similarly, like if you go to CrowdStrike has this neat repository of actors that if you want, you could just go to this link on CrowdStrike.com/adversaries, and it showcases pretty much their naming convention. So China, panda; Russia, bear; Iran is kitten. They're all kind of homologous to the country's national animal. At least that's the case. I don't actually think that Egypt's national animal is a sphinx because they don't really exist. At least I'm pretty sure they don't. Kitten is also kind of a nudge at Iran, because when I said earlier that a lot of groups are simultaneously hacktivist, nation state, and cyber criminal, that most easily applies to Iran, because what their threat actors will do typically is that they will pretend to be a hacktivist group that is, ideologically moving when it's in reality going in accordance with Iran's national objectives. So that's just kind of like the annoying thing about threat intelligence that needs to be out of the way. I know detections were mentioned earlier, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because this is kind of a product that you could have once you do your research. And these are called YARA rules. YARA stands for yet another recursive language, and essentially it is a detection language where if conditions are met, it will pop a detection. It doesn't function in the same way that a EDR will, or that a SIEM will, where it will create an alert. It has to be integrated into an existing tool. But what's good is this is an easy way to kind of like pick up new samples. So this is just kind of an example of the syntax. So with this rule, if a file goes through where string 1 and string 2 are present, it gets detected by the YARA rule. Similarly, we have an example with domains and more strings. And this condition, any of them is just kind of an OR operator for any of these 6 strings. We could also do the hex files, the hexadecimal values that are present inside a binary. There's also a regex feature for it. And a lot of times you could configure specifically for things like fishing and whaling. Whaling is just fishing, but for a much bigger fish. Whaling, yeah, I mean, very creative. But for this rule, it would pick up anything that has the name of this made-up CEO, and it's agnostic to the case, as well as any HTTPS URL. So this is a lot of times, if you do threat intelligence work and research, you could create and put together these rules and send this to your security engineering or detection team, and they will implement them. And that's kind of how you are able to use the intelligence you find to enrich defenses. Are there APT groups for the US or Western European countries? That's a very good question, and there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is yes, but don't worry about it. What you'll find is that because companies like CrowdStrike service, members of the US intelligence community, like for example, the NSA, a lot of their research is entirely focused on countries that have neutral to adversarial alignments with the US. So let's say hypothetically you were in China and you were working for a Chinese cybersecurity company, you would more than definitely be doing research on US APTs. But because where we stand, inherently it has that geopolitical aspect to it. So you won't ever find companies like CrowdStrike, Cisco, Palo Alto reporting on American APTs, even though it's well documented that they exist. And the same is true for Western European countries. GCHQ in the UK is known for having very talented hackers. Same with France's intelligence service. We're almost there. So one thing I do kind of want to emphasize with threat intelligence work is it's not forensic work. You're not focused on the depth and the construction of the artifacts and the timeline of how they move throughout a system. It's investigative work. What it really is you're trying to answer the who, what, where, and why. You're functionally, you could think of it as being a journalist, or more probably an intelligence analyst, but just in a cybersecurity context. And that also means it comes with all the same pros and cons of these kinds of investigative roles. A lot of times it's easy to romanticize it and see it as something like, it's so cool, you're like, putting a name and a face to a hacker, and you're kind of going like toe to toe with them. But it's very frustrating work, and a lot of the times it can yield to all the same issues that very similar lines of work do, in the sense that you get stuck on your own biases. You're kind of always going to be looking for something just to be able to prove something and have something, as opposed to being completely objective. So it's investigative work, but it's it's difficult and it's, not the easiest to be optimistic about. And one last thing I kind of want to talk about is just kind of the tools that are used. So I'll actually start from the bottom up because these are easy to go over. Like Brendan had mentioned, malware analysis is actually a great skill to have, but it's not required. Same for geopolitical analysis. These just really help contextualize and enrich the picture we're trying to paint. A lot of time, if you do anything related to threat intelligence, you do a lot of writing, and you have to have strong writing skills. Foreign languages are also a plus, and sandbox environments. So if you don't have the malware analysis skills and the ability to decompile and reverse engineer binaries, having the ability to use a sandbox, if I could stop logging me out. I use this one at a few meetings as an example. This is any.run. So you could directly upload a file or you could search for files. So I'm just going to do, hold on, where is, actually, I'm just going to my history. Amazing. Okay, let's just do a new analysis. This is so annoying. They changed the UI. Okay, here we go. I don't like it. I did WannaCry with here before, so I'm just gonna do that just for the sake of just this being pretty quick, because we're almost up on time and we're almost done here. But a sandbox, you could throw a file into this, and it will show you step by step the execution and the processes without having to actually decompile anything. So it's definitely a useful tool for contextualizing what files you do have. And a lot of times, if you check a hash, you'll see that it is already uploaded from a different user. And like to drill on the topic we talked about earlier, if I were to change one thing about this, like let's say if I were to change the UI on a WannaCry and change this S down here on context S to be capital, this entire hash would be completely different. And the last tool that I kind of want to talk about are specific search engines. So we searched up Lou Bloom, the investigator. Yeah, I did put some examples because I wanted it to look cool. Did I just get rid of Zoom? No, it's still here. Just making sure. Is my screen not sharing anymore? Oh, weird. Okay. Sorry about that. So when we searched up that, hold on. This is so frustrating. Okay, so we used Valden a little bit earlier to search up a domain, and that gave us some information on it. And we could also use these kinds of search engines to look up specific threat profiles. So I'm going to try to see if there's any ones that I recognize here. Okay, this is a North Korean APT. Kim Suki are also referred to as APT-C55 or Emerald Sleep by Microsoft or Velvet Shalima by CrowdStrike. So it's nice that a lot of these tools kind of bring everything together. And here you have all the reported IOCs with it. So you have a lot of domains. You're going to have URLs somewhere here. Yep. Here we go. Download subdomain. Here's some more. These are resources as to like if you want to do further research on them. These are kind of just like public reportings. A lot of times people will report their findings on Twitter. And this is a good way to kind of just like further contextualize. If you're worried about, let's say, for example, the specific North Korean APT, you could go here. You could find all the IOCs, download them, and then integrate them into your detection tools. And like I said, next workshop we're going to talk about specifically how you can go about what's it called? Using that to hunt for further infrastructure. Similarly, a lot of these search engines do largely the same thing. I kind of highlight the ones that are most common and most often used. Hunt.io is a really good one because this one will also specifically show you open directories and C2 infrastructure. But this one is pretty new and still kind of, I'm not super familiar with it. But yeah, largely, I think if you do want to get more into threat intelligence space, there's a lot of really interesting case studies that have all within the last few years. These two books I read, and I would highly recommend them. Sandworm is about how a group of researchers and malware analysts were able to find malware being used by Russian intelligence against the Ukrainian power grid, and it's written like a true crime novel, and it's very fascinating. Countdown to Zero Day is about Stuxnet. If you haven't heard of Stuxnet, it's basically the world's first known cyber weapon, where it had these 4 0 days used to disrupt the Iranian nuclear reactor. And then on the left here, I just have some courses. If you really want to dive into the weeds, CTI 101 is completely free. This threat intelligence self-study article is also free. This was made by an individual who is an instructor for the threat intelligence SANS course. If you know anything about SANS, those courses are about $8,000 and way too expensive. But she kind of just put together a free combination of resources to kind of get the same effect. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me just